The quiet life of Henry Crawford. Henry Crawford had seen enough war for 10 lifetimes. At 62 years old, with silver hair and weathered hands that told stories of decades working the soil, he'd earned his retirement from the chaos of military service. After serving in World War I as a young engineer, he returned to his family's farm in the Solomon Islands, determined never to see combat again. The year was 1942, and the world had plunged into another devastating conflict. But Henry had made his peace with distance. His small farm sat on a hillside overlooking a pristine bay, where coconut palms swayed in the tropical breeze and the ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon. He'd married a local woman named Alina, raised 3 children who'd long since left to pursue their own lives, and settled into a routine of simple pleasures, tending his vegetable garden, fishing in the early mornings, and playing chess with Father Michael at the village church every Thursday evening. But war has a way of finding you, even when you've run to the edge of the world to escape it. The first sign came on a humid Tuesday morning in March. Henry was feeding his chickens when he heard the distant drone of aircraft engines. Looking up, he squinted against the bright sky and counted 12 planes flying in tight formation, heading northwest. They bore the unmistakable red circles of the Japanese Imperial Navy on their wings. Over the following weeks, the flights became regular. Sometimes twice a day, formations of bombers and fighters would pass overhead, heading toward Allied positions on Guadalcanal. Henry would watch them from his porch, a knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. The war he tried to escape was literally flying over his head. The Japanese had established a major airfield on a neighboring island, and intelligence reports filtering through the local resistance network suggested they were planning a massive offensive. The Allied forces were stretched thin, their own air power barely sufficient to defend their positions. Every Japanese plane that made it through meant more destruction, more death. Henry tried to maintain his peaceful routine, but sleep became elusive. He'd wake before dawn, haunted by memories of the trenches of France, of friends who'd never made it home. Alina would find him on the porch, staring at the sky, waiting for the morning's first flight. "You cannot carry the weight of this war alone, my love," she told him one evening, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I'm not carrying anything," he replied, but they both knew it was a lie. The turning point came on a clear April morning. Henry was working in his garden when he heard the engines approaching earlier than usual. Looking up, he saw not the typical high-altitude formation, but a single Japanese reconnaissance plane flying low over the coastline, clearly photographing the area. As the plane banked over the bay, something caught Henry's eye. The pilot appeared to be following the coastline carefully, using visual landmarks to navigate. And then Henry noticed something else. The way the morning sun reflected off the water seemed to briefly disorient the pilot, who dipped his wing uncertainly before correcting course. That's when the idea struck him. Insane, impossible, brilliant. Henry Crawford, retired farmer and former military engineer, stood in his vegetable garden with dirt on his hands and began to laugh. It was a wild, slightly unhinged sound that made Alina rush out of the house in concern. "Henry, what is it?" He turned to her, eyes blazing with an intensity she hadn't seen in years. "I know how to stop them," he said. "I know how to bring those planes down. But they're going to think I'm completely mad." He was right about that. What Henry Crawford was about to propose would sound absolutely insane to anyone who heard it. But sometimes the craziest ideas are the ones that just might work. The reconnaissance. Henry Crawford spent the next 3 days doing something he hadn't done in years: reconnaissance. Armed with a pair of binoculars he'd owned since his military days and a notebook filled with increasingly detailed observations, he tracked every Japanese flight that passed over his section of the island. The pattern became clear quickly. The Japanese planes followed the same basic routes, using the coastline as a primary navigation reference. This made sense from a tactical perspective. In 1942, aircraft navigation relied heavily on visual landmarks, especially over oceanic regions where radio navigation was unreliable and vulnerable to interference. The pilots needed to see where they were going. What fascinated Henry most was how low some of the flights came. Bombers returning from missions, presumably low on fuel and eager to land, would descend to barely 800 feet as they approached their home base. Reconnaissance planes flew even lower, sometimes skimming at 500 feet to get better photographs and visual intelligence. This was the vulnerability Henry had identified. At those altitudes, planes were exposed to environmental factors that pilots at 10,000 feet never had to consider. On the fourth day, Henry made a trip to the village to speak with Father Michael. The elderly priest had become the unofficial liaison between the local population and the small contingent of Allied military advisors operating in the area. If Henry was going to do what he was planning, he'd need official cooperation, or at least assurance that he wouldn't be arrested for sabotage against his own side. Father Michael listened to Henry's proposal with increasingly wide eyes. "You want to do what?" the priest asked when Henry finished explaining. "I know it sounds insane," Henry admitted, "but mathematically it should work. I've run the calculations 3 times. Henry, I knew you were an engineer, but this—" Father Michael shook his head in disbelief. "This is either brilliant or the scheme of a madman. Possibly both. Will you arrange a meeting with the Allied command?" The priest studied Henry's face, seeing the determination there, the same intensity that must have helped him survive the horrors of the Great War. Finally, he nodded. "I'll send word, but they'll want proof of concept. They'll want evidence that this isn't just the fantasy of a farmer who's spent too much time in the sun." "Then I'll give them evidence," Henry replied firmly. That evening, Henry sat at his kitchen table with Alina, spreading out his notes and sketches. His wife looked at the diagrams with a mixture of concern and admiration. "This could work," she said softly, "but it will be dangerous, Henry. If the Japanese discover what you're doing, if the Japanese discover what I'm doing, they'll think I'm just a crazy old man playing with mirrors," Henry said with a slight smile. "Which, technically, I suppose I am." "You're not old," Alina corrected, squeezing his hand. "Just crazy." Over the next week, Henry began his preparations. Using salvaged materials from around the farm, old sheets of metal, polished tin from discarded containers, and even breaking apart some old mirrors that Alina had been meaning to throw away, he constructed his first prototype. The principle was simple, even elegant in its simplicity. Light, reflection, heat, and timing. For basic elements that, when combined correctly, could create a lethal environment for low-flying aircraft. The Allied officers who finally arrived to hear Henry's proposal were skeptical, to put it mildly. Captain Robert Morrison, a lean, tired-looking American Air Force officer, listened to Henry's explanation with barely concealed incredulity. "Let me get this straight," Morrison said. "You want to use mirrors. Mirrors. To shoot down Japanese planes. Not shoot them down directly," Henry corrected patiently. "Disorient and disable them using a combination of reflected light and thermal updrafts created by concentrated solar heating. The planes are already flying low and following predictable routes. If we can create enough visual confusion and atmospheric disturbance at key points along their flight path, we can force navigational errors that lead to crashes." Morrison exchanged glances with his fellow officers. "Mr. Crawford, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but we're fighting a war here, not conducting science experiments." "Then let me demonstrate," Henry said quietly. "Give me 1 week and minimal resources. If I can't provide proof of concept, you'll never hear from this crazy old farmer again." The experiment. Captain Morrison agreed to Henry's proposal with the air of a man humoring a harmless eccentric. He assigned 2 enlisted men to assist, provided some basic supplies, and made it clear he expected nothing to come of this mirror scheme, as the soldiers were already calling it. Henry didn't mind the skepticism. He'd faced doubt before, in the trenches of France when he'd proposed engineering solutions to problems that had stymied his superiors. Doubt was fuel. It kept you sharp, made you prove every assumption. The location Henry selected was a narrow point along the coastline where the Japanese reconnaissance planes regularly flew low, following the beach line as they approached their airfield. The geography was perfect, steep cliffs on one side, the ocean on the other, creating a natural corridor that funneled air traffic through a predictable path. Henry's plan required 3 separate components, all working in concert. First, the reflection arrays. Using the salvaged mirrors and polished metal sheets, Henry constructed a series of angled reflectors positioned on the cliffside. These weren't meant to be weapons in the traditional sense. Instead, they were designed to create intense, precisely timed flashes of reflected sunlight that would hit pilots at critical moments, causing temporary vision impairment and disorientation. The key was timing. A single flash was an annoyance, but multiple flashes in rapid succession, coming from different angles, could overwhelm a pilot's ability to maintain visual reference with the horizon and their instruments. Henry had experienced this phenomenon himself during the Great War, when artillery fire and explosions had created similar disorienting light conditions. The second component was more complex: thermal generators. Henry constructed a series of large, black-painted metal panels that would be positioned on the cliff face. When exposed to the intense tropical sun, these panels would superheat the air directly in front of them, creating powerful thermal updrafts. Aircraft flying through these invisible columns of rising hot air would experience sudden, violent turbulence and lift variations. Again, the principle was simple physics. Hot air rises. Very hot air rises very quickly. An aircraft encountering this unexpected atmospheric disturbance at low altitude, while already disoriented by the reflection arrays, would have difficulty maintaining controlled flight. The third component was psychological: unpredictability. Henry planned to vary the timing and intensity of the arrays, making it impossible for Japanese pilots to anticipate when they might encounter the effects. Some flights would pass unmolested. Others would face the full treatment. This uncertainty would create additional stress and cognitive load on pilots already dealing with the challenges of combat operations. The two enlisted men assigned to help, Private Tommy Chun and Corporal Mike Sullivan, initially treated the whole operation as a joke. But as they watched Henry work, measuring angles with mathematical precision, calculating sun positions at different times of day, testing reflection patterns, their attitudes shifted. "Old man knows what he's doing," Sullivan admitted on the third day, wiping sweat from his forehead as they positioned another thermal panel. "My grandfather was an engineer on the railroad," Chun said. Same look in his eyes, like he's seeing something the rest of us can't. By the end of the week, the installation was complete. Henry had constructed 4 reflection array stations along the cliff, each capable of producing precisely angled light bursts. The thermal panels covered nearly 200 square feet of cliff face, painted in a black coating that Henry had mixed himself using charcoal, tar, and other materials. In the intense tropical sun, these panels reached surface temperatures exceeding 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Captain Morrison arrived for the demonstration with 2 other officers, clearly expecting to humor the old farmer and then return to real military duties. "All right, Mr. Crawford," Morrison said, "show us this miracle of yours." Henry checked his watch. The next regular reconnaissance flight passes in approximately 12 minutes. They fly this route every day at 14:30 hours, following the coastline at about 600 feet altitude. "And you think your mirrors are going to do what?" "Exactly. Watch," Henry said simply. First blood. The 12 minutes felt like 12 hours. Henry stood at his observation post, binoculars ready, while Captain Morrison and his officers waited with poorly concealed impatience. Private Chun and Corporal Sullivan manned the reflection arrays, ready to adjust angles on Henry's signal. At 14:28, Henry heard it, the distinctive high-pitched whine of a Mitsubishi reconnaissance plane's engine. Right on schedule. Target approaching from the southeast, Henry called out. Altitude approximately 550 feet, speed 180 knots. Chun, prepare Array 1. Sullivan, stand by on Array 3. Morrison raised his own binoculars. A single plane emerged from the coastal haze, following the beach line exactly as Henry had predicted. The red circles on its wings were clearly visible in the afternoon sun. "Steady," Henry murmured, tracking the plane's approach. He'd calculated the precise moment when the aircraft would enter the optimal zone. Everything depended on timing. The plane drew closer. Henry could now see details: the open cockpit, the pilot's leather helmet, even the camera mount beneath the fuselage. "Array 1 out," Chun adjusted his mirror station, and suddenly the cliffside erupted with light. Concentrated beams of reflected sunlight, each precisely angled, converged on the approaching aircraft. From Henry's position, it looked like a constellation of small suns had suddenly appeared on the cliff face. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The Japanese plane suddenly dipped and wobbled. Through his binoculars, Henry could see the pilot's head jerking as he tried to maintain visual reference. Array 3 now. Sullivan's station added its contribution, hitting the aircraft from a different angle just as it entered the zone of superheated air above the thermal panels. What happened next unfolded in seconds, but seemed to occur in slow motion. The plane, already unstable from the visual disorientation, hit the thermal column at a slight angle. The sudden vertical lift on one wing sent the aircraft into an uncontrolled roll. The pilot attempted to correct, but he was flying too low and too slow, with insufficient altitude to recover. The reconnaissance plane's wing tip caught a palm tree at the edge of the beach. The aircraft cartwheeled once, twice, and then slammed into the sand in a shower of debris and dust. The fuel tank ruptured, but didn't explode, spilling aviation fuel across the beach. For a moment, nobody spoke. They simply stared at the wrecked aircraft lying on the beach like a broken toy. Captain Morrison slowly lowered his binoculars. His face had gone pale. "Holy Mother of God," he whispered. "You actually did it. You actually brought down a plane with mirrors and hot air." Henry was already moving, grabbing a medical kit. "Chun, Sullivan with me. The pilot might be alive." They scrambled down the cliff path to the beach. The Japanese pilot had been thrown clear of the wreckage, lying motionless in the sand. Henry checked for a pulse and found one, weak but steady. The man's leg was badly broken, and he had a head injury, but he would survive. "Get him to the village medical station," Henry ordered. "He's a prisoner of war now, and he'll be treated according to the Geneva Conventions." As Chun and Sullivan carried the wounded pilot away, Morrison approached Henry with a new expression, respect mixed with something like awe. "Mr. Crawford, I owe you an apology. I thought you were a crank with a crazy theory. But this..." He gestured at the wreckage. "This is real. This works." "One plane," Henry said quietly. "We need to scale this up. We need to cover all the major approach routes to the Japanese airfield. And we need to do it fast before they figure out what's happening and change their flight paths." Morrison nodded slowly. "What do you need?" "More men, more materials, and authorization to construct similar installations at 5 other locations around the island. Also, I'll need accurate intelligence on Japanese flight schedules and routes." "You'll have it," Morrison said firmly. "All of it. As of right now, Operation Reflector is officially sanctioned. I'll have engineers and supplies here within 48 hours. Henry allowed himself a small smile. "Operation Reflector. I like that. There's just one question," Morrison said. "Why didn't you stay in the military? With a mind like yours, you could have been..." "I saw enough death in the last war," Henry interrupted softly. "I came here to grow vegetables and live in peace. But if this war is going to find me anyway, then I'll fight on my terms. And, Captain, we're not trying to kill these pilots if we can avoid it. We're trying to stop their planes. There's a difference." Morrison studied the old farmer's face and saw the steel beneath the weathered exterior. "Understood. But the Japanese might not see it that way if they find out what you're doing." "Then we'll make sure they don't find out," Henry replied, "until it's too late." Expanding the web, word of Henry Crawford's successful demonstration spread through Allied command like wildfire. Within 3 days, his quiet hillside farm had been transformed into the headquarters of what was now officially designated Special Project Reflector. Engineers, enlisted men, and even a few curious officers arrived to see the mirror arrays and thermal panels that had brought down a Japanese aircraft using nothing more sophisticated than reflected sunlight and basic physics. Henry found himself in the unfamiliar position of being in command. Captain Morrison had secured official authorization from higher command, and suddenly the retired farmer had a team of 40 men under his direction, along with resources that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. The challenge was time. Intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese were planning a major bombing offensive within 3 weeks. Every plane that made it through could tip the balance in the upcoming battle. Henry needed to construct 5 more installations before the offensive began. He divided his team into 6 groups, each led by someone who demonstrated understanding of the reflection and thermal principles. Private Chun took charge of Installation 2, positioned on a coastal cliff 3 miles north. Corporal Sullivan headed Installation 3, covering an inland route the Japanese used when weather forced them away from the coast. Henry designed each installation to match its specific location and the flight characteristics of the planes that used that route. Some sites focused on bombers returning from missions, flying low and slow, laden with fuel. Others targeted the faster reconnaissance planes that regularly photographed Allied positions. The work was grueling. Teams labored from dawn until dark, hauling materials up cliff faces, positioning mirrors with mathematical precision, painting and mounting the thermal panels. The tropical heat was oppressive and the physical demands were severe, but the men worked with purpose. They'd seen the wreckage on the beach. They knew this insane scheme actually worked. Alina became the unofficial quartermaster of the operation, organizing food supplies, water, and equipment. She also served as a liaison with the local islanders, many of whom volunteered to help once they understood what Henry was trying to achieve. "You're building a web," she observed one evening, studying the map where Henry had marked all 6 installation sites. "Like a spider's web, but made of light and heat." "Exactly," Henry replied. "Each installation covers a specific section of airspace. Together, they create a network of hazards that the Japanese can't navigate around without adding significant time and fuel to their flights. And time and fuel are things they don't have in abundance." The second successful interception came on day 8 of the construction phase. Installation 2, under Chin's direction, caught a flight of 3 Japanese bombers returning from a raid on Allied positions. The lead plane, already struggling with engine damage from anti-aircraft fire, hit the thermal column and lost control. It crashed in a coconut grove 2 miles from the installation. The pilot survived and was taken prisoner. The other 2 bombers in the formation, seeing their leader go down inexplicably, broke formation and fled, abandoning their planned return route for a longer, less direct path back to their airfield. "That's almost as good as shooting them down," Morrison noted when he heard the report. "If they're so spooked they're burning extra fuel to avoid this area, we're achieving our objective." By day 15, all 6 installations were operational. Henry had created a network of invisible hazards covering the most commonly used Japanese flight routes around the island. The mirror arrays were synchronized with sun position tables Henry had calculated, ensuring optimal reflection angles throughout the day. The thermal panels had proven even more effective than anticipated, with several modifications suggested by the engineering team. But success brought a new problem: Japanese countermeasures. After losing 5 aircraft in 2 weeks to unexplained crashes and control failures, the Japanese began changing their tactics. Flights started coming in higher, at 1,500 feet or more, well above the effective range of Henry's thermal columns. Reconnaissance missions were reassigned to different times of day, avoiding the peak sun hours when the reflection arrays were most powerful. Henry gathered his team leaders for an emergency planning session. "They're adapting," he said, pointing to the flight pattern maps. "We're no longer catching them by surprise. We need to evolve our approach. Can we extend the effective range of the thermal panels?" Sullivan asked. "Not significantly," Henry replied. "The physics just doesn't scale. Hot air dissipates too quickly." "What about different mirror angles?" Chun suggested. "If they're flying higher, we adjust our reflection patterns to hit them at those altitudes." Henry nodded slowly. "That could work for the visual disorientation component, but without the thermal turbulence, it's less effective. We need both elements working together." Then Alina, who'd been listening quietly from the corner, spoke up. "What if you made them come lower?" Everyone turned to look at her. "What if you created a reason for them to descend?" she continued. "Something they have to investigate or avoid?" Henry's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Decoys. false targets that forced them to drop altitude to identify or attack. Exactly, Alina said with a smile. You can't change the sky, so change what's on the ground. It was brilliant, and it was insane, which meant it was perfect. The bait, creating effective decoys, proved to be as much art as science. Henry needed to construct false targets that would fool Japanese aerial reconnaissance while being quickly deployable and easily hidden when not in use. Most importantly, investigating these decoys had to force pilots to descend into the effective range of his reflection arrays and thermal columns. The solution came from an unexpected source, the island's fishing community. Old nets, dyed and arranged on clearings, could mimic the appearance of camouflaged equipment from altitude. Carefully positioned boats with fabric stretched over frames created shadows that looked like concealed vehicles or artillery pieces. Even scarecrows, dressed in old military uniforms and arranged in formation, could pass for troops at 1,500 feet. But the masterpiece of the deception was Henry's Phantom Base. Working with a team of islanders and soldiers, Henry constructed what appeared from the air to be a hastily concealed supply depot. Large crates, actually empty and made of lightweight wood, were arranged in patterns that suggested ammunition storage. Camouflage netting covered areas that appeared to contain vehicles. There were even false anti-aircraft positions, complete with logs painted to look like gun barrels. The entire installation was positioned in a valley directly beneath one of Henry's reflection array sites. The Japanese can't afford to ignore what looks like a major supply depot, Morrison said, surveying the fake base. They'll have to send reconnaissance to investigate, and probably bombers to destroy it. And to do that, Henry added, they'll have to come down to 800 feet or lower, right into our kill zone. The psychological component was crucial. Henry wanted to create uncertainty and doubt in the minds of Japanese pilots and commanders. Every time they spotted something suspicious, they'd have to decide, real target or trap, investigate or ignore. The cognitive load of these constant decisions would be exhausting and would inevitably lead to mistakes. Installation 4, which had seen limited success due to Japanese altitude changes, was reinforced with a network of these decoys. Chin's team spent 3 days constructing false targets that required investigation. Each decoy was positioned to draw aircraft directly over or through the installation's effective range. The first test came on a cloudy morning when a Japanese reconnaissance plane spotted the Phantom supply depot. The pilot, following standard procedures, descended to investigate, dropping from 1,800 feet to 700 feet as he made a slow pass over the valley. Henry watched through his binoculars as the plane entered the kill zone. Even through cloud cover, the reflection arrays produced enough concentrated light to be effective. The thermal columns, superheated by hours of morning sun, created invisible rivers of turbulent air. The reconnaissance plane hit the turbulence and dropped suddenly. The pilot, already dealing with reduced visibility from the clouds and the disorienting light flashes, overcorrected. The plane's nose pitched up sharply, the aircraft stalled, and then it was falling, tumbling through the air before slamming into the jungle canopy with a crunch of breaking trees and twisted metal. This time, there were no survivors. Henry stood silently, looking at the smoke rising from the crash site, feeling the familiar weight of death settling over him. Target destroyed, Morrison reported clinically. That's number 7. Number 7, Henry repeated quietly. 7 young men who won't be going home. Morrison looked at him sharply. They would have killed Allied soldiers. They would have bombed our positions. This is war, Henry. I know what it is, Captain. I've known since 1914. That doesn't mean I have to celebrate it. Over the next week, the pattern repeated itself. Japanese aircraft, drawn by the decoys, would descend to investigate, and Henry's invisible web would catch them. Some crashed outright. Others were damaged and forced to make emergency landings, where they were captured by Allied ground forces. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots began to show. Intelligence reports from captured airmen revealed growing superstition among the flight crews. They spoke of ghost lights and invisible demons that haunted certain valleys and coastal areas. Some pilots refused to fly the routes. Others demanded to fly only at high altitudes, sacrificing fuel efficiency and navigation accuracy. The Japanese command attempted various countermeasures. They sent fighters to escort reconnaissance planes, but the escorts couldn't protect against environmental hazards they couldn't see or understand. They tried night flights, but Henry's thermal columns remained effective even after sunset, and the reflection arrays could be adapted to use moonlight on clear nights. By the end of the third week, Operation Reflector had accounted for 15 downed Japanese aircraft. Not all were direct kills. Some were forced landings. Some were damaged aircraft that crashed elsewhere. But all 15 were taken out of action through Henry Crawford's invisible web of light and heat. Then the Japanese offensive began. On a hot Tuesday morning, radar stations detected a massive formation of Japanese bombers and fighters heading toward Allied positions on Guadalcanal. The attack force numbered over 80 aircraft, the largest single raid of the campaign, and they were flying directly through Henry's network of installations. "This is it," Morrison said, standing in Henry's observation post. "If your system works on this scale, we could break their offensive before it really begins." Henry didn't answer. He was checking his watch, calculating sun positions, reviewing the positions of all 6 installations. Every piece had to work perfectly. There would be no second chance. The first formations appeared on the horizon at 9:15 hours. The battle for the sky was about to begin. The gauntlet. The Japanese offensive formation was massive, a sky-darkening swarm of aircraft arranged in precise military geometry. The bombers flew in V formations at 2,000 feet, surrounded by fighter escorts. It was an impressive display of aerial power, and under normal circumstances, the Allied forces would have been hard-pressed to stop them. But these were not normal circumstances. Henry had prepared for this possibility. The 6 installations had been positioned to create a gauntlet, a series of hazard zones that the Japanese would have to navigate in sequence if they maintained their current course. He'd studied the aerial photographs and intelligence reports, calculating the most likely approach routes based on Japanese doctrine and the location of their targets. The first installation the formation would encounter was Sullivan's Site, covering a broad coastal approach. Installation 3, this is command. Henry spoke into the radio that Morrison had provided. Target formation approaching from bearing 145, altitude 2,000 feet, speed approximately 200 knots. Prepare to engage as they descend to attack altitude. Installation 3 confirmed. Sullivan's voice crackled back. Arrays ready. Thermal panels at maximum temperature. Standing by. Henry knew the Japanese wouldn't maintain 2,000 feet all the way to their targets. Standard bombing doctrine required them to descend to 800 to 1,000 feet before releasing their payloads for accuracy. The question was when they would begin their descent. The formation drew closer. Through his binoculars, Henry could count individual aircraft. 32 bombers, at least 40 fighters. The drone of their engines rolled across the island like distant thunder. Then the lead elements began to descend. Right on schedule, right on course. All installations, this is command, Henry announced. Formation is descending. Prepare to engage on my mark. Remember, we're targeting the bombers primarily. Fighters will be disoriented, but harder to bring down. Installation 2 ready. Installation 3 ready. Installation 4 ready. One by one, all 6 sites reported ready status. Henry felt his heart pounding. This was different from picking off individual aircraft. This was a full-scale engagement against overwhelming numbers. Installation 3, engage. Sullivan's arrays erupted with light. The coastal cliffs blazed like a second sun had suddenly appeared. The concentrated beams of reflected sunlight swept across the descending bomber formation like searchlights. The effect was immediate. The tight V formations wavered. Pilots, suddenly blinded by the intense light flashes, struggled to maintain position. 2 bombers drifted out of formation. One pilot, completely disoriented, pulled up sharply, directly into the path of his wingman. The two aircraft collided with a sickening crunch, pieces of both planes tumbling toward the ocean. 2 down, Morrison reported. Installation 3 showing effect. But the Japanese weren't helpless. Fighter escorts, realizing something was wrong, dove towards Sullivan's position, machine guns blazing. Bullets tore into the cliff face, shattering some of the mirrors and forcing the crew to take cover. Installation 3 taking fire. Sullivan's voice came through strained. Mirrors damaged, continuing operation with reduced capacity. Chen engage. Henry ordered. Draw their attention. Installation 2, positioned 3 miles north, activated its arrays. More concentrated light lanced across the sky. The bomber formation, now thoroughly disrupted, broke into smaller groups. Some climbed, tried to escape the inexplicable hazards. Others pressed on, determined to reach their targets. That's when they hit the thermal columns. The superheated air currents, invisible and unpredictable, threw the low-flying bombers into chaos. One aircraft flipped completely inverted before the pilot could recover, slamming into the jungle. Another went into a violent spin, its wings ripping off from the aerodynamic stress. 4 down, 6 down, 7 down. Morrison was counting now, his voice rising with each report. Henry, this is working. They're breaking formation. But Henry's face was grim. The fighters are adapting. They're figuring out that the light and turbulence are coming from specific locations. They're going to attack the installations directly. Even as he spoke, a group of Japanese fighters peeled off from the main formation, heading straight for Chen's position. Machine gun fire erupted across the hillside. Henry heard Chen's voice on the radio, shouting orders to his crew to take cover. All installations, this is command, Henry spoke urgently. Enemy fighters are targeting your positions. Maintain operation as long as possible, then abandon equipment and take cover. Human lives are more important than mirrors. Installation 6 reporting, another voice came through. We're seeing the main bomber force changing course. They're trying to go around the network. Henry checked his maps. If the Japanese maintained their new heading, they'd pass between installations 4 and 5, potentially avoiding the worst of the hazard zones. But it would also force them into a longer approach, burning more fuel and exposing them to Installation 4. Henry spoke quickly. Activate the decoy protocols. Make them think there are targets directly ahead of their new course. Confirm deploying decoys. The false targets appeared almost magically. Smoke generators hidden in the jungle created plumes that looked like enemy encampments. Fabric panels were pulled away from carefully arranged patterns that resembled anti-aircraft batteries. The Japanese, already disoriented and desperate to salvage their mission, saw what looked like priority targets directly in their path. The bombers descended again, dropping into the kill zone between installations 4 and 5. Light erupted from both positions simultaneously. The crossfire of reflected sunlight created a dazzling, impossible-to-navigate maze of brilliance. Thermal columns rose like invisible pillars, throwing aircraft into wild gyrations. 10 down, 12 down, 14 down, Morrison's count continued. Henry, they're turning back. The formation is breaking up. It was true. The Japanese offensive, faced with inexplicable and seemingly supernatural hazards, was collapsing. Bombers were jettisoning their payloads harmlessly into the ocean and jungle, desperately trying to gain altitude and escape. Fighters, running low on fuel and unable to protect their charges, were disengaging. By the time the battered remnants of the Japanese formation retreated toward their home airfield, they'd lost 23 aircraft. Not a single bomb had fallen on Allied positions. The offensive had been shattered before it even reached its targets. In his observation post, Henry Crawford lowered his binoculars. His hand was shaking, and he realized he'd been holding his breath. Around him, the radio crackled with reports from all 6 installations. Damage, casualties, but also triumph. Morrison was staring at him with something like wonder. 23 Japanese planes in one engagement, and we did it with mirrors and sunshine. We did it with physics and psychology, Henry corrected quietly. And yes, a bit of madness. The Reckoning. The aftermath of the failed Japanese offensive reverberated far beyond the Solomon Islands. Intelligence reports indicated chaos at Japanese command levels. Pilots who'd survived the gauntlet spoke of supernatural phenomena, of valleys that swallowed aircraft and lights that blinded and disoriented. Some refused to fly at all. Others demanded reassignment to different theaters. For Henry Crawford, the victory was bittersweet. In the week following the engagement, 3 more Japanese aircraft were brought down by the network of installations. That brought the total to 26, with another 14 forced to turn back or crash land elsewhere due to damage and disorientation. 40 aircraft, taken out of action by reflected light and hot air. The military brass wanted to expand Operation Reflector. Morrison received orders to construct similar installations on other islands to train teams in Henry's methods. The retired farmer's insane trick had become official military doctrine. But Henry himself was done. "I built this to defend my home," he told Morrison one evening, sitting on his porch as the sun set over the bay. "I didn't build it to become a permanent part of the war machine." "You've saved lives, Henry. Allied lives that would have been lost if those bombers had reached their targets." "I know, and I've taken lives too. 40 Japanese pilots. Young men, probably with families, with dreams beyond this war. I see their faces at night now, just like I see the faces from France." Morrison was quiet for a moment. "War doesn't care about our moral struggles. It just is." "Maybe," Henry replied. "But I care. And I'm tired, Robert. So very tired." In the end, Henry agreed to train other teams in his methods. He spent 3 weeks teaching soldiers and engineers the principles of reflection arrays, thermal columns, and psychological warfare through environmental manipulation. He shared all his calculations, all his designs, all his hard-won knowledge. Then he went home to his farm. The 6 installations continued to operate under military supervision. By the war's end, they'd accounted for over 60 Japanese aircraft losses, 40 from crashes attributed directly to the installation's effects, and another 20 or more from indirect causes like forced landings, collisions during evasive maneuvers, and fuel exhaustion. The Japanese never fully understood what was happening. They identified the general areas as hazardous and tried to avoid them, but Henry's network had been positioned too strategically. Any route that avoided the installations added significant time and fuel consumption to Japanese flights. The psychological impact alone degraded Japanese air operations for months. After the war, when records were opened and historians began piecing together the full story, Operation Reflector was classified as one of the most unusual and effective defensive systems of World War II. Military analysts marveled at its elegant simplicity. No expensive equipment, no sophisticated technology, just mirrors, paint, metal panels, and the genius of one retired farmer who remembered his physics and engineering. Henry Crawford lived another 30 years. He returned to his quiet life, growing vegetables, fishing in the mornings, playing chess with Father Michael on Thursday evenings. He never spoke publicly about his role in the war, despite numerous requests for interviews and offers to write his biography. "I was just a farmer who got angry about planes flying over his house," he would say when pressed. Anyone with basic engineering knowledge could have done the same thing. But that wasn't true, and everyone who knew the story understood it. What Henry had created required not just knowledge, but imagination, courage, and a willingness to believe that the impossible might be possible if you approached it from the right angle. Alina understood. On quiet evenings, she'd find him on the porch, staring at the sky, watching the contrails of commercial aircraft that now flew in peace. "Do you regret it?" she asked him once. Henry thought for a long moment. "I regret the war. I regret the deaths. I regret that the world needed such things. But the work itself? No. When faced with evil, you use what tools you have. Mine happened to be mirrors and mathematics. And a little bit of madness," Alina added with a gentle smile. "Yes," Henry agreed, taking her hand. "Always a little bit of madness. The best ideas usually are." When Henry Crawford died in 1975 at the age of 95, his obituary in the local paper mentioned that he'd been a farmer and a veteran. It said nothing about Operation Reflector Nothing about the 40 Japanese planes his insane trick had brought down. The story remained classified, known only to military historians and a handful of veterans who'd served with him. But on the islands where he'd lived and fought his strange, brilliant battle, the locals remembered. They told their children and grandchildren about the farmer who'd used sunlight as a weapon, who'd turned physics and psychology into shields for their homes. And sometimes, on clear days when the light hit the coastal cliffs just right, old-timers would point to the glints and reflections and say, "That's old Henry's magic, still there after all these years." It wasn't magic, of course. It was science, ingenuity, and courage. But maybe, in the end, those things were magic enough. The 6 installations were eventually dismantled after the war, the mirrors and thermal panels removed, the sites returned to their natural state. But the story lived on, a testament to the idea that sometimes the most effective weapons are the ones that don't look like weapons at all. And sometimes, the most important battles are won not by the young soldiers on the front lines, but by the old farmers who refuse to let war destroy their homes without a fight. Henry Crawford's legacy wasn't measured in medals or commendations. It was measured in the lives saved by his impossible idea, in the proof that innovation and intelligence could be just as powerful as bombs and bullets, in the demonstration that age and retirement were no barriers to courage and contribution. His story remained a footnote in history, known to few but understood by those who studied it as something remarkable. Proof that even in the darkest times, even against overwhelming odds, one person with knowledge, determination, and yes, a little bit of madness could change the course of events. The retired farmer who took down 40 Japanese planes with mirrors and sunshine taught the world that sometimes the craziest ideas are the ones that just might work.